Today I want to talk about the organ grinder as well as the monkeys. When I talk about the organ grinder, I talk about those people that set the political, social and cultural agenda, and normally in a private investment for private profit society, a capitalist society. That's those people who've amassed wealth and have a significant impact on the economy. Parliament, in a parliamentary democracy, normally works within those constraints, and it passes legislation which has a direct impact on individuals, communities, the nation as a whole. We've seen this with the submarine purchase. We see it with the government's insistence of ignoring the independence struggle in West Papua, 70 kilometres from our shores. We saw it in terms of the introduction of legislation which have a greater impact on people with less power and less resources. We see it every day. Now, we are told consistently that the difference between us, a liberal capitalist democracy, it's not a liberal democracy, it's a liberal capitalist democracy, let's get that right, and a socialist government or a communist government, is the fact that the bureaucracy is not politicised. Now, obviously, any parliament can pass legislation, but if it doesn't have the power to enforce that legislation is basically irrelevant. And we see that in the case of civil war, and we see it in the case of a dual power situation where people are struggling to obtain power within a particular geographical region. So, what is the bureaucracy? A lot of people seem to have forgotten in this country, where we don't seem to have much of an understanding of how society functions. If we need to have that pointed out, look at the ridiculous reaction to a piddling referendum like a voice to Parliament for First Nations people. But that's another story which I'll look into at a later date in these presentations. So theoretically, in a liberal capitalist democracy, or in a liberal capitalist representative democracy, we actually don't live in a democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. We actually live in a representative democracy where we elect representatives to make decisions for us, and the type of the decisions those representatives are able to make are, into a significant degree, constrained by dominant economic forces and people who manipulate and control the economy. I'm talking of corporations, transnational, local, and the list goes on and on. So what's the bureaucracy? Well, the bureaucracy, the armed forces is a bureaucracy. The police at various state levels are a bureaucracy. Parking officers are part of a local council bureaucracy. Then the health department, education department at a state and federal level, they all have bureaucracies in order to carry out those decisions. And it's not unusual in a liberal capitalist representative democracy to have a significant proportion of the population involved in the bureaucracy. So, what is different about our bureaucracy compared to a bureaucracy of a one-party state, like say China or Russia? Let's forget about the isms, but a one-party state. And the answer is nothing. We are told the bureaucracy is there to give the minister and Parliament free, unfettered advice in terms of legislation, in terms of implementation of legislation. But But more importantly, in terms of implementation of legislation, the bureaucracy isn't involved in making decisions at a parliamentary level and creating laws. It's there to carry out those laws, to carry out those programs. Unfortunately, a bureaucracy in a one-party state and a bureaucracy in a liberal, capitalist, representative democracy is exactly the same. If anybody had any doubts, they could look at two recent examples. One is the robo-debt fiasco, when the bureaucracy knew that what was proposed, that what was being implemented was a gross travesty of justice, as well as illegal. The other example, recent example in the last few years, is how the Victorian Health Department outsourced its responsibilities during the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues, and gave that responsibility to a private sector which didn't have the experience or knowledge to carry out that process. In both cases there were consequences. As far as robo-debt is concerned, we saw hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Australians pushed around, humiliated, ostracised, commit suicide. Smaller numbers become, all because of an illegal government action. And as far as the COVID-19 hotel fiasco, in terms of hotel quarantine fiasco given to a private sector which didn't even know what a mask was, resulted in the unnecessary spread of the disease and deaths. We see the same situation with the armed forces. And now it's very important in any society who controls the armed forces, what they are about. And we are now seeing the appointment of people in authority in the armed forces whose primary responsibility is to the government of the day. We are seeing governments, when elected, appointing heads of departments, heads of bureaucracy, who have a similar ideological bent to the government of the day. And we see this over and over again. For example, recently a member of the armed forces who was in control of border security, when he retired as a member of the armed forces, joined the Liberal Party, was elected to Parliament, and unfortunately he recently died of, I think, carcinoma. But again, it highlights how it is not, the bureaucracy is not, cannot give free, fair, unfettered advice. We see this in the legal system, where every single legal appointment, whether it's a state level or a federal level, which includes the Federal Court and the High Court and VCAT and not VCAT and Appeals Tribunal, every one of those appointments, especially the appointments to the higher courts, are political appointments. We see this in the United States of America. And the process is so opaque that one member retires, another member is appointed. We don't even know the reasons why they're appointed. And we see this over and over again. So what we are seeing is an ideologically driven bureaucracy who has no responsibility to the people it provides services for. And this is highlighted by the fact that over the last few decades, citizens who interact with government departments and people with permanent residence who interact with government departments are considered to be customers. Not citizens with rights and responsibilities, not permanent residents with rights and responsibilities, but customers of government department. So we are seeing a huge issue in the bureaucracy. When a bureaucracy is ideologically driven at the higher levels, we see the development of resistance within the bureaucracy to implementing government decisions. And more importantly, we see a lack of interest and a lack of compassion and empathy in with bureaucrats when they interact with the people they provide a service for. So, to a significant degree, the problems we all face continue ad nauseum, irrespective of government legislation, irrespective of bureaucratic implementation of that government legislation. And we see this over and over again. Public housing, especially in Victoria and New South Wales, is a significant example of what happens when you have an ideologically driven public housing department. Although the organ grinder carries out the order, although the organ grinder makes the music, it is the bureaucrat at a senior level who sets the agenda. And if you have bureaucrats who are appointed with specific ideological positions, who have a relationship to the dominant political party at that particular point in time, you can actually inhibit change, stop the implementation of positive change. And we see this over and over again. Have governments battle with a sluggish bureaucracy in terms of introducing change which is beneficial to citizens. So, problems. Huge problems. Even if governments want to introduce legislation which is beneficial to citizens and permanent residents, an ideologically driven bureaucracy, despite a change of government, can and does sabotage this. More importantly, it gives advice to government that the only way forward is to follow a particular ideological pathway. That's why if the public housing fiasco in Victoria and New South Wales, we have discussions about social housing, affordable housing, inclusive housing, which is all privately owned and all managed by the private sector. And we see the running down of a public housing sector which could provide accommodation, not just emergency accommodation, but accommodation to people who are not able to buy in the private marketplace. And that is an increasing number of people, up to 40% of the population. Now, we don't have to follow this particular pathway. One thing that could be introduced is rules and regulations or legislation which denies appointments to the bureaucracy, even at the lowest level, for people who are members of political parties. We see that in the Australian Electoral Commission, where if you're a member of the Australian Electoral Commission and you oversee elections at the state, federal, union level, you're not able to be a member of a political party. You need to resign from that political party. We shouldn't see people appointed to positions of authority in the bureaucracy, whether it's the health, police, armed forces, education, roads, traffic, at the state and federal level, and the list goes on and on. If those appointees are members of political parties. Now it's interesting that as far as the Australian Constitution is concerned, the founding people who founded the Australian nation on the 1st of January 1901 understood that dilemma. And you cannot stand for political office if you hold a position that involves you with the Crown, where the Crown pays your wages. You need to resign before you can stand. And we should see the same thing in the bureaucracy. Over and over again, we've seen too many decisions that are made that are implemented with such vigour, they cause so much damage because the politicalisation of the bureaucracy. Over and over again we are faced with that dilemma, and unless we face up to the fact that we are no different as far as the bureaucracy is concerned, a liberal capitalist representative democracy is no different to a one-party state, or even a dictatorship, or a communist state, or a socialist state, where to be a member of the bureaucracy you need to be a member of the party. Although you don't need to be a member of the party, you need to have the same ideological bent. And as far as the leadership positions in the bureaucracy are concerned, it is not unusual for those people to be members of the party and given these positions as some type of present by the party when they gain power for their loyalty when that particular political party was in opposition. So things can be complex. We all know about the organ grinder who tells the monkeys in Parliament within what parameters they can work with, because of the type of economy you have, these corporations are too big to fail. But how many of us realise that much of the inaction which occurs in our society, many of the problems which occur in our society, occur because the bureaucrats cannot give free, unbiased advice to their political masters. Because if they do, especially the senior bureaucrats, they will lose their position of authority. If you look at the Australian Broadcasting Commission Board, if you look at the High Court, if you look at the Federal Education Department, the Federal Health Department, the Armed Forces, the various various state police forces, you look at the Federal Police, you will see that same ideological bent. That's the party which is in power, which determines the direction of the bureaucracy. Robo-debt is a classic example of what occurs when this occurs. Classic example. And unfortunately, it is occurring far too often because the bureaucracy is being privatised. Important functions which should be carried out by the bureaucracy to deliver services to the people of this country are now out of their hands. Many of the large bureaucracies, whether it's educational, health, roads, traffic, whatever, are basically institutions which give out contracts to private corporations to carry out work which should be carried out by the bureaucracy after Parliament has made certain decisions. And that's why we don't see change. When 40 cents of every dollar goes in profit administration costs for a private corporation, that's 40 cents of every dollar, taxpayer's dollar. Obviously, there's never enough money to look after the needs of people. So next time you're involved in interaction with the bureaucracy, think about that. Think about the politicised nature of the bureaucracy. Think about the type of society we've become. And next time you've got a warm inner glow because somehow you think we're better than Russia or China or even North Korea or Saudi Arabia, and the list goes on and on. Think again. Although we like to think of ourselves as a liberal, capitalist, representative democracy, the fact is that we have politicised the very instruments which should be there to give advice to governments, and the very instrument that should be there to give non-ideological assistance to the people of this country.